Hey guys, and welcome back to another video from History Revision Success to try and help you get the grade 9 that you deserve. So today I'm going to try and go through the migration course. That's AQA's thematic option of migration. So it's a really interesting module. I think it's, fantastic that it's on the curriculum. I do think it's very dense at the start, and there's so many different kings, and I think it can get very confusing. So what I've tried to do in this video is go through all of those different kings. Who are they? Where do they come from? Who was usurping the throne? Who was stealing the throne? When were the Vikings invading? Why were they doing so? What happened with Normandy and the Norman kings? And, how do we end up with the 100-Year War after kind of John and Richard? Why does that all happen? So that's the aim of the video. Keep watching if that's helpful to you. And if you're studying migration, it'd be really helpful for me to know. So please leave some comments or like the video if this kind of thing helps you. So it all starts off with Alfred of Wessex, often called King Alfred the Great. Now, during his reign, that's when the Vikings decided they weren't just going to come and plunder England, they were going to stay. And so during his reign, we have that kind of motivation from the Vikings to come and create settlements. Now, it's very important to understand that during this point in history, England is divided into kingdoms. It's not one united entity. So in the first place, Alfred is king of the West Saxons. Now, his place is Wessex, which I have circled for you there. Wessex was the most powerful of these kingdoms. Often it was the king of Wessex who then later was the king of England in later times and later kings. And he was Alfred of Wessex. Now, one reason for his significance is arguably he is able to become the first king of a united England. Now, some people say that it's Athelstan, his grandson, and I'll get to him in a little bit. But, there's definitely a plausible argument there that for his significance, he managed to be king of the English to an extent. Now, during his reign, he had to defend from multiple Viking invasions. In 850 AD, the Vikings decided they wanted to settle, and they landed in the north and eventually managed to capture York by 866. So this was a big shift because prior to this, Vikings had come and plundered and then returned. By 1870, they had been able to capture most of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Okay, so these are very big kingdoms in England, and it meant they turned their attention to Wessex and Alfred. Now, Alfred was able to win a very decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. And this meant he was able to make an agreement with the Vikings that England was going to be divided into kind of two sections, Anglo-Saxon territory and Danelaw. Now, the Danelaw was the Viking ruled area, and they had, Viking customs, Viking names, places, Viking gods, all that kind of stuff. They were able to live as they chose. And as you can see on the map, the pink area is the Danelaw. So that's also another reason why Alfred is significant, because we saw the creation of Danelaw. Now, if you go and do some research, Danelaw has many lasting, relevant it's still relevant to this day for many reasons, which will help you with your significance question. For example, our days of the week arguably are named after Norse gods: Thursday, Thor; Friday, Freya. But go and have a look at that. Now, that means he was no longer king of the West Saxons. He was now king of the Anglo-Saxons. So Alfred is the first king to be king of a united area. He controlled most of Mercia. He controlled Wessex. He becomes king of the Anglo-Saxons. Now, in between Alfred and the next king that your course focuses on, there are a number of kings which you don't need to know about. However, I think it's very hard to understand and picture how England changes between Alfred and Edgar without understanding what happens with these people in between. So starting off with Edward. Now, Edward the Elder is the elder son of Alfred the Great, and he is able to conquer Viking-ruled southern England. So he takes from the Danelaw the areas of kind of East Anglia, Essex and Kent, and it left only Northumbria under Viking control. Next came Athelstan, and he was the son of Edward. And during his reign, he is able to take control of Northumbria. Now, he is regarded as one of the greatest Anglo-Saxon kings. And technically, he becomes the first king of the English. He unites the whole of England under one ruler. And it's at this point we stop using king of the Anglo-Saxons and we use king of the English. He even manages to invade Scotland and force Constantine II to submit to him. So he's a very successful military king, and he pushes the Vikings out of England. So England is once again united as an English nation. Now, after him, we have Edmund, his younger brother, and then Eadred, another son of Edward, so another brother of Edmund and half brother of Athelstan, and then Edwig, who is the oldest son of Edmund, became king at 15 on the death of his uncle. So all of these kings are English kings who are ruling England, but they are not mentioned in your course. The next king that is somewhat mentioned is Edgar the Peaceful. Now, he's the brother of Eadwig and the younger son, so he's the brother of Eadwig, our last king, and the younger son of Edmund. He is, during his reign, the kingdom is very stable. Nothing really significant happens. But what is important is that when he dies, he leaves two sons by two different mothers. So there's Edward, who is 12 on his father's death, and Athelred, who is 9 on his father's death. Now, Edward becomes king first, and he's often called Edward the Martyr. Now, the reason for this is that as the oldest son, he should have inherited. However, he was not the most popular choice of heir, and he wasn't even the designated heir of his father either. He only manages to rule for 3 years, at which point he is murdered. We don't know who murders him, although there's lots and lots of rumors to say that it was, a group of people who supported his younger brother, or even the mother of his younger brother, because they had different mothers. But anyway, it leads to Athelred becoming the next king. Now, Athelred is a very significant king for your course. He's often called Athelred the Unready, and he was a very young boy when he took the throne. So he was absolutely kind of manipulated and led by advisors. Now, the Unready part of his nickname comes from this translation of Old English to suggest that unready might mean ill-advised. He had advisors that were often corrupt. They wanted to make money. He wasn't a very good judge of character, and being very young, he was unable to really select people who were good for him and helped him in a positive way. Now, during Athelred's reign, the Vikings make a return to England. So we see huge waves of Vikings seeking fame and fortune, wanting to come and plunder England. In 991, there is a huge Viking invasion led by the Dane Sven Forkbeard, which arrives at Folkestone with 90 ships and leads to the Battle of Malden. Now, the English were heavily defeated, and they have to pay the Vikings Danegeld in order to make them leave England. Now, Danegeld was extremely expensive, and it cost as much as £900,000 in today's money. Athelred is very concerned about this. People do not like paying the taxes he has to charge to pay the Danegeld. So he looks for an alternative to help him fight the Vikings, and it leads him to Normandy. Now, Normandy obviously is just across the Channel in France, and it was kind of a place where Vikings were going and resting, and then launch boarding off essentially to invade England. So he makes an alliance with the Duke of Normandy, and the Duke of Normandy promises that he will not let the Vikings shelter there any longer. And in return, Athelred marries the Duke's sister Emma to give the Duke some power in England. So Athelred's now married Emma of Normandy. Kind of swept up in this feeling of strength, he then does something arguably very silly, and he carries out a massacre, a mass killing of Viking men, women, and children at a settlement, a Viking settlement, and it's called the St. Brice's Day Massacre. Now, unfortunately for Athelred, he kills Sven Forkbeard's sister, Gunhilda, during this massacre, which leads Sven to initiate a huge invasion of England with the ideal goal of conquering and taking over England. At this point, Athelred flees to France with his family, and essentially Sven rules England for a year. And we have a Viking king on the throne. So he's also the king of Denmark and Norway, and he rules England from 1013 to 1014. Now, Sven dies just 1 year later, and he intends his son Knut to inherit the throne. However, Athelstan sees this opportunity, and he returns at the very end of Sven's life and essentially takes the throne back for himself. So Knut is no longer in England. Knut has left and gone back to Viking-held territories, and Athelred has made his return and rules for a further 2 years back on the throne. Now, Athelred leaves his throne to his eldest son, Edmund, who inherits. However, Edmund doesn't last long either, because at this point, Knut decides to return and claim back the land that his father left for him, that he sees himself as being the rightful king of. So Knut returns, and we have fighting, and Knut beats Edmund at the Battle of Assendun, and they agree that Edmund is going to rule Wessex and Knut is going to rule the rest of the country. When one of them dies, the other one is going to take over the rest of England. Now then, very kind of coincidentally, Edmund dies 1 month later. You know, we don't know for sure, but it could be suspected that perhaps he was murdered or he died of wounds from the battle. But Knut is king of England. So Knut the Great becomes king of England, and then he later inherits lands in Denmark and Norway through his other relatives. Now, it gets a little bit complicated at this point, and I'm going to run through with a family tree just afterwards. But Knut's eldest son from his first wife is Harold. So Harold takes the throne first. However, while Knut is still alive, he makes kind of a diplomatic move, and he marries Emma of Normandy as his second wife. So by marrying her, he gives himself a stability, because he's marrying the very well-established wife of the old king. Now, this leads to kind of an era of peace, and we have 20 years of very stable, peaceful rule. Despite being Danish, he actually lives in England as his main domain. He sees it as his kind of main place, and he invites lots of Danish nobles to come over and settle in England, really focusing on creating that stability in England rather than ruling it as kind of, a foreign dominion, a part of his empire. With his second wife, Emma, the widow of Athelred, he has a son called Harthacnut. So when Knut dies, his eldest son by his first wife, Harold, becomes king first. After Harold dies, the younger son, the son of Emma and Knut, Harthacnut, becomes king. Now, both of these sons, Harold and Harthacnut, are not particularly well liked in England. They're both seen as kind of foreign rulers. They don't have the skills, the strength that their father did, and they are unable to create kind of lasting stability, and they don't last very long on the throne. When Harthacnut dies, he doesn't have any children, so his throne passes to his half-brother through his mother, which happens to be the younger son of Athelred and Emma, and that man is Edward the Confessor, somebody which you might have heard of, very relevant for kind of the crisis of monarchy that we all learn about, William the Conqueror, etc. I'm just going to run through a little family tree to try and make this as clear as possible. So Athelred marries Emma of Normandy, and they have many, many, many children, although the only two I'm going to really focus on are Edmund and Edward, the two who become kings. So Athelred marries Emma, Edmund and Edward. When Athelred dies, his son Edmund takes the throne. However, it's very short-lived, because Knut the Great is deciding to come back and fight Edmund for the English throne, bringing with him his oldest son, Harold. Edmund is then also killed, so Canute becomes king. He decides to marry Emma to cement his stability and his claim to the throne. They have a son, Harthacnut. Canute dies and Harold takes the throne. Harold dies and Harthacnut takes the throne. When Harthacnut dies, you can see it makes logical sense for the throne to pass back to Edward, Harthacnut's half-brother. So I think that can be a bit confusing, but hopefully visualizing it like that will make it clearer for you. But that is how Edward the Confessor becomes King of England. Now, as I said before, he's probably one of the most famous kings of England. I think we've all studied him at some point because we all learn about 1066. But as the king of Emma and Athelred, he has spent most of his life living in France. They escaped to France when Forkbeard invaded during Forkbeard's reign. So he is accepted by the Anglo-Saxons, but he very clearly favours Normans and Norman kind of way of ruling. He speaks French better than he speaks English. Most of his friends and close allies are French, Normans, including William the Conqueror. Essentially, he kind of, that's why he favours William the Conqueror on his death. So on his death, he obviously creates this crisis of monarchy that we see, because we have Harold Godwinson, who is announced by the Witan to be king, an Anglo-Saxon English king. However, we have William the Conqueror, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. So Harold is king essentially for less than a year, and then we have the invasion by William the Conqueror, who takes the throne next. So just to clarify very quickly how this passage of the crown happens, in case you weren't fully aware, Edward obviously dies with no heirs. Harold Hardrada is a Viking ruler of Normandy and Denmark, who also claims to have a right to the throne through his Viking predecessors. And, following the video, hopefully you can see why the Vikings have played a role as English kings. Witan select Harold Godwinson. However, we have a first battle, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, between Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada. Hardrada lands in England near York, and they have a battle near York. Now, he is defeated by Godwinson, so Harold gets rid of that claimant. However, at the same time, William of Normandy lands in down south, so Harold Godwinson has to rush down south to fight William at the Battle of Hastings, and unfortunately for him, he's unable to defend against both of these invaders, and William the Conqueror is successful and is crowned on Christmas Day. So this kind of begins the period of Norman kings of England. Crowned on Christmas Day, after his defeat of Harold Godwinson at Hastings, he faces numerous rebellions from the English. He very much kind of Normanizes, if that's the word, England. He puts Normans in all the top jobs in the church. He makes Norman noblemen. He gives them power, he gives them land, and the Normans start off this kind of idea of building castles. So the reason we have castles in England, that really comes from the Normans. On his death, things get a little bit interesting. So his Norman kingdom, which is Normandy and England, are divided between his sons. And he has 3 sons. He has Robert, he has William, and he has Henry. So his oldest son, Robert, is given Normandy. His middle son, William, is given England. And his youngest son, Henry, is given nothing. Now, in 1100, William dies. And that means that Henry takes over control of England. So Henry is now Henry I, King of England. Henry then decides to fight his brother Robert and takes control of Normandy as well. So the youngest son, who inherited nothing, somehow manages to defeat both of his older brothers and take all of their land. So essentially that's how we get Henry I, who is still very much kind of a French king, essentially a Norman king. And he is King of England and Duke of Normandy. Now, he rules for 20 years. He has a daughter called Matilda, who he marries to a very powerful French lord, Geoffrey of Anjou. And however, on his death, he wants the throne to pass to his daughter. However, a very powerful noble, Stephen, one of his nephews, so the grandson of William the Conqueror, takes the throne instead. Now, over the next period of time, Matilda fights Stephen for the crown for 19 years. So for the whole of Stephen's reign, Matilda is fighting him for the crown back. And eventually they reach an agreement that Matilda's son, Henry, is going to be the next king. So Stephen will continue out his reign. When he dies, Matilda's son, Henry I's grandson, will take the throne. And that leads us to the crowning of Henry II. So we have Henry II. Now, he is the first Plantagenet king, okay? He's also incredibly powerful. And it's very, very interesting to see all the lands that he was in control of. So Henry II, he inherits Normandy from his mother. He inherits Anjou and Maine through his father. Remember, his father was Geoffrey of Anjou. He inherits the Duchy of Aquitaine. He becomes the Duke of Aquitaine through his wife. He marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is one of the largest and most powerful regions in France. He then marries his son. First of all, he becomes the Count of Nantes through a treaty, and then he marries his son into the Duchy of Brittany. So he gains control of Brittany as well. So you can see that Henry II is in control of almost all of kind of Western central France. Now, this is what we call the Angevin Empire. So he controls all of the yellow land in France, he controls all of the land in England, and he kind of has a tenuous control of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland as well. So he is incredibly powerful, and he brings all of this French land into English control. Now, this is really where we see the initial kind of the origin of the 100-Year War, and this kind of desire, even through the Tudor kings, of having land in France, because, you know, centuries back or generations back, England actually had control of this much of French land. So he has many children, of which two are important. The first being Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, and his youngest son, John, being King John. And if you know much about kind of political history, you will know that John is incredibly important when we think about his role in the creation of Magna Carta, but I'll get there in a second. So two quite famous children who both become kings. Now, Richard, called Richard the Lionheart often, on his ascension to the throne, you know, he controls all of this land in France. However, rather than really kind of looking after it and developing it and being there to deal with rebellions, he's off fighting the Crusades in kind of Cyprus and places like that in the world. So he really neglects kind of the French Empire. And under Richard, obviously, as to be expected, there are many rebellions by French areas who want to be self-governed, or who want to have a French king rather than this kind of distant English king who isn't even in, you know, anywhere near the vicinity of ruling them. So, for example, King Philip II took over large areas of land during Richard's reign, including parts of Normandy. This is the beginning of the shrinkage of this Angevin Empire, which would have been very hard to govern regardless, but even more so because Richard simply is never there. He is off on the Third Crusade, and if you want to have a look at the map, it's the red arrows is where they go on the Third Crusade. Now, when Richard dies, his younger brother John becomes king, and John really kind of cements the loss of France as part of England's empire. I say empire, kind of English control at the time. John is not a very good king, if I'm going to be brutally honest. You know, historians have suggested that maybe we judge him too harshly, but he was not very military profound. He wasn't very military successful, and he gets the nicknames of Soft Sword and Lackland for kind of his poor military ability. And he loses almost all of the French kingdom by 1215, the Angevin Empire is reduced to just Gascony. So England loses, as you can see from the picture, you know, all of the red, it's gone. And that is why the 100-Year War is kind of motivated. It's this idea of regaining that land back in France that the English kings have lost. And interestingly, it's kind of Richard and John who primarily lose that land in France. Now, obviously, there's an argument to suggest, could any English king have held on to it? Because it was so vast and it was so difficult to rule England and France as two separate entities. So yeah, that is a little rundown of all of the different kings in the migration topic up to the 100-Year War. After the 100-Year War, you know, you go into the Tudors and the Stuarts, and it's not so focused on the kings of England and who's coming into the country and who's ruling the country. So I think from this point onwards, it gets a bit simpler. But I just wanted to run through that for you. So please do let me know if this is helpful, what videos you'd like to see in the future. Liking the video and subscribing to the channel is really helpful and means I'll be able to continue making these videos. So yeah,